the history of lumbar disc herniation. The ancient Romans and the Greeks were the first to really have a sciatica described in text, and then moving up to the Byzantine period, that's when we really start crediting with the first known laminectomy, spinal fracture resulting in spinal cord compression. 1555, Vesalius identifies and describes the intervertebral disc, and in 1779, Pott identifies the link between sciatica and deformities of the spine, Pott of the infamous Pott's disease. 1814, moving ahead into the 1800s, Klein does a historic multi-level laminectomy for a thoracic fracture dislocation associated with signs of complete paraplegia. The patient lasted for 3 days after this, and this was a huge argument against spine surgery. They thought that this was detrimental to people and not helping them. 14 years later, Smith performs the first successful laminectomy in a patient who'd fallen from a horse and sustained a traumatic paraplegia. This patient survived and had a partial recovery, so now kind of gets spine surgery back into the fray of things. 1857, Virchow first describes intervertebral disc pathology. They described a fractured disc at autopsy. 1887, Horsley does the first and most celebrated lumbar laminectomy for spinal tumor. And then 1896, Coker identifies a traumatic disc rupture at autopsy. And then finally, finishing up the 1800s, Makins and Abbott do 24 cases of laminectomy for vertebral osteomyelitis. So a lot of these names you'll see or hear as you get into the OR. A lot of these people have instruments named after them and other things. So they've all been pretty influential in spine surgery. Moving into the 1900s, Oppenheim and Krauss do the first transdural intervertebral discectomy, so through the dura instead of moving the dura out of the way. They erroneously reported this disc as a chondroma. And then Charles Ellsberg of the Neurological Institute of New York, who was one of the most influential writers on spinal decompression, published a series of laminectomies in 1913 and subsequently published a textbook with regards to laminectomy in 1916. In 1911, Goldwaith describes and illustrates how weakening of the annulus fibrosus could result in dorsal displacement of the nucleus pulposus. So you kind of see where we're headed here. Probably most of you know the name Dandy. He described the first 2 cases of herniated lumbar disc causing cauda equina. This is the first consideration of decompressive laminectomy for intervertebral disc disease. This is, for those of you keeping score at home, 100 years after the first laminectomy, and then even 20 years after the first spinal fusion operations. So, really kind of out of order here, honestly, with our thinking. And then in 1932, Mixter and Barr first to describe the relationship between the disc herniation and radiculopathy. This was a landmark paper you can see there in the bottom right in 1934, with a series of 34 patients with herniated discs. They also reevaluated all the recent cases that were misdiagnosed as a chondroma at Mass General and retrospectively diagnosed them as ruptured intervertebral discs. 1939, Love gives the first description of an extradural laminectomy technique. And then this guy in this picture here is Ghazi Yazergil. Some of you may have heard his name before. Yazergil's very infamous for microsurgery. 1967, he is the first to use a microscope for a discectomy. And then in 1977, he and Kaspar published the first results of lumbar microdiscectomy, Kaspar of Kaspar pin and Kaspar distractor frame. So when you see a ACDF for the first time, you'll see this is used in nearly every case. So obviously just showing very influential people to neurosurgery and to spine surgery in general involved in the lead up to what we know today as, the microdiscectomy and laminectomy. And then Robert Williams in the United States is kind of a forgotten pioneer of spinal microsurgery. In 1978, he popularized and published the technique in the United States.
Hey everyone, Ryan Rad here from neurosurgerytraining.org. If you like that video, subscribe and donate to keep our content available for medical students across the world.